My name is Tom Avery, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in late October, during what was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip with my wife and daughter. What unfolded in the woods of Laurel Hill State Park still feels like a fever dream, a dark smear on my memory that I'll never fully understand. I'd planned the trip as a way to reconnect with my wife, Lisa, and our 6-year-old daughter, Ellie. Things had been strained lately, mostly my fault. Lisa and I barely talked anymore, and Ellie was starting to notice. So I thought some time away from everything, just us, the RV, and the forest, might help. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The air was cool, the leaves golden and crisp underfoot. Laurel Hill State Park was everything I'd imagined. Remote, quiet, untouched. The RV site we chose was near the woods, with no other campers in sight. It felt like we had the entire park to ourselves. "That's a good thing," I said, forcing cheer into my voice as I unpacked the gear. Peace and quiet for once. Lisa didn't respond, but I caught her eyeing the tree line like she was searching for something. She'd read about the park's ghost stories online and was eager to explore, but I wasn't in the mood for that nonsense. Ellie, on the other hand, was thrilled. She darted around the campsite, poking at logs and picking up acorns. "I'm going to find a fairy house," she declared. Lisa smiled, and for a moment, I thought maybe this trip might actually work. But then the little things started. Little things that I shrugged off at first. The trouble began after sunset. We sat around the campfire eating hot dogs and s'mores. Ellie was unusually quiet, staring into the flames like she was listening to something. "Ellie," Lisa said gently, "what's on your mind?" Ellie glanced at her, then at me. "Lila doesn't like the fire." Lisa frowned. "Who's Lila, sweetie?" Ellie shrugged. "She's my friend. She lives here." It was classic Ellie, her imagination always running wild. But something about the way she said it made my stomach turn. I laughed it off, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, tell Lila she can join us. We've got plenty of marshmallows." Ellie didn't laugh. "She doesn't like you." The next morning, we set out on a hike. The trail was narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed darker than they should have been. I told myself it was just the thick canopy overhead, but the air felt heavy, like we were walking into a cave. About a mile in, we found the playground. It didn't make sense. No one had mentioned a playground in the park guide. The equipment was ancient. A rusted swing set, a splintered seesaw, a merry-go-round with peeling paint. Ellie's face lit up. "Can I play?" she asked, already running toward the swings. "Ellie, no!" I called. The place looked like it could collapse any second, but Lisa stopped me. "Let her," she said, her voice soft. "She needs to burn some energy." Reluctantly, I agreed. Ellie climbed onto the swing, laughing as she pumped her legs. For a moment, her joy was infectious. But then she stopped, her legs dangling, staring at something I couldn't see. "Lila's here," she said. Lisa and I exchanged a glance. "Ellie?" Lisa asked carefully. "Where's Lila?" Ellie pointed to the merry-go-round. "She's right there." There was nothing there, just empty space. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lisa and Ellie were out cold in the RV, but I kept hearing things outside. Soft laughter, like children playing, and the sound of footsteps circling the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The forest was silent. The laughter stopped the moment my boots hit the ground. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees. Nothing. No one. But as I turned to head back inside, I saw them. Tiny, muddy footprints leading from the woods to the RV door. My stomach dropped. I locked the door behind me and didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, Ellie was unusually quiet again. As Lisa and I argued about whether to cut the trip short, Ellie sat at the little RV table, scribbling furiously with her crayons. "Ellie, what are you drawing?" Lisa asked. Ellie held it up. It was a crude picture of our RV, surrounded by black, stick-like figures with glowing eyes. My chest tightened. "Ellie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "who are they?" She tilted her head. "They're the Watchers. Lila says they don't like us here." Lisa's face went pale. "Tom, we need to leave." Reluctantly, I agreed to one last hike before we left. Lisa said she wanted to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. I went along to keep the peace, though I didn't believe any of it. Ellie came too, skipping ahead of us, humming a strange tune. We found it near the playground. A tree, its bark etched with deep carvings. Words, barely legible through the moss. "They are hollow, and so will you be." "What the hell does that mean?" I muttered. "It's a warning," Lisa whispered. She stared at the carvings like they were some ancient puzzle. "Tom, these aren't just ghosts. They're something worse." "Worse?" I scoffed. "What's worse than ghosts?" Lisa's voice trembled. "They're hollow spirits. They take people, make them hollow like them." I didn't believe her, not fully. But something about the way the air felt, thick and electric, made me grab Ellie's hand and pull her back toward the RV. That night, everything came to a head. Ellie started humming again, that same strange tune. Then she spoke, her voice unnaturally deep. "Lila says you should leave." Lisa froze. "Ellie, what?" "She doesn't want you here," Ellie said. Her head snapped toward us, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "She says it's our turn." Lisa screamed, and I lunged forward, grabbing Ellie's shoulders. Her skin was ice cold, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't hers. "Ellie!" I shouted. "Snap out of it!" She blinked, and just like that she was back to normal, staring at me in confusion. "Daddy, why are you yelling?" We decided to leave that night, but as I started the RV, the headlights flickered and died. The engine sputtered and refused to turn over. "They don't want us to leave," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Then the laughter started again, closer this time. Shadows moved outside, circling the RV. The windows rattled as something knocked against them over and over. I grabbed the campfire poker and swung open the door. One of the figures, a pale, childlike thing with hollow eyes and 2 long limbs, lunged at me. I swung the poker, its tip blazing with embers, and the thing shrieked, retreating into the woods. Lisa remembered something from her research. Hollow spirits could be repelled by offering something personal, something valuable. Without hesitation, she pulled off her wedding ring and threw it into the campfire. "Take this!" she screamed. "Just let us go." The shadows stopped. The laughter ceased. The air grew still. For a moment, I thought it worked. But then Ellie screamed, her body convulsing as the shadows swarmed her. "No!" I roared, grabbing her and pulling her away. Lisa threw more belongings into the fire. A necklace, her favorite book, anything she could find. "Take it all." The shadows hesitated, then slowly faded into the woods. Ellie went limp in my arms, her breathing shallow but steady. We didn't sleep. As soon as the RV started, we drove. The shadows didn't follow, but their presence lingered, a heavy weight in the back of my mind. Ellie seemed fine, normal even, but when we asked her about Lila, she said she didn't know anyone by that name. Lisa and I barely spoke the whole drive home. Weeks later, I caught Ellie humming that strange tune again. When I asked her about it, she just smiled. "Lila taught it to me." I didn't sleep that night. I haven't slept much since. Driving past Laurel Hill one day, I saw her. A little girl with red hair, standing barefoot at the edge of the woods, watching me. Her hollow eyes burned into mine, and then she smiled. My name is Sarah Miller, and I'm 34 years old. This happened in late September during what was supposed to be a routine solo camping trip. I'm a travel blogger, specializing in uncovering hidden gems for fellow adventurers. But what I found in Devil's Den State Park wasn't anything I could have prepared for, or wanted to share. I arrived at Devil's Den late in the afternoon, parking my RV in a secluded spot at the edge of the forest. The campground was quiet, the kind of peaceful solitude I craved after the chaos of my last few weeks. My ex had moved out only a month ago, leaving behind a tangle of emotions I hadn't fully untied. This trip wasn't just for work. It was to find some peace, maybe even closure. The air was crisp, the leaves just beginning to shift to their autumn colors. A park ranger named Elliot had greeted me at the entrance and seemed surprised that anyone would camp here alone. "Not many come to this part of the park," he said, his weathered face lined with something like concern. "Just make sure you stay on the marked trails, and don't wander too far after dark." I smiled, thanking him, but his words stuck with me. The way he glanced at the dense trees as if they held secrets, as if he didn't want to tell me everything. I set up a fire as the sun dipped behind the horizon. There wasn't another camper in sight, which wasn't unusual for a weekday in a lesser-known park. I was alone with the crackling of the flames and the hum of nocturnal insects, perfect for working on my blog. Around midnight, I heard something strange, a soft, rhythmic sound like footsteps. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, probably a deer, but the steps were heavy, deliberate, circling my RV. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. "Hello," I called, my voice steady despite the chill creeping up my spine. Nothing. Just the trees standing still in the moonlight. But when I lowered the beam of my flashlight, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. I hurried back inside, locking the door. It was probably just another camper. Someone passing by curious about the fire. That's what I told myself. The next morning, I woke to find a dead deer sprawled at the edge of my campsite. Its eyes were gone, and its body was arranged unnaturally, legs bent at impossible angles. My stomach turned. I grabbed my phone to call the ranger station, but there was no signal. The isolation that had felt so inviting now pressed down on me like a weight. I forced myself to take a few photos, partly for documentation, partly for my blog, and packed up a small day bag to hike to the nearest ranger outpost. Before I left, Elliot appeared again, stepping out from the trees as if he'd been watching me. "Looks like the woods have been busy," he said, nodding toward the deer. "You're better off packing up and leaving." "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's out here?" Elliot hesitated, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Just don't camp too far off the trails. And if you hear anything at night, don't follow it." "What does that mean?" I pressed, but he just tipped his hat and walked back into the woods. That evening, I stayed close to the fire, my nerves on edge. As I stirred a pot of soup, a voice called out from the darkness. "Mind if I join you?" I jumped, nearly spilling the pot. A man emerged from the shadows, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He was tall, with sharp features and a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you," he said. "I'm Nathan. Got a little turned around on the trails." I hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Sarah? Sid, I guess." Nathan was charming, the kind of conversationalist who could draw you in without you realizing. He asked about my work, my life, even my breakup, things I hadn't mentioned. When I asked how he knew about the deer, he just smiled. "This park has a history," he said, leaning closer. "You've heard the stories, haven't you, about the Devil's Campsite?" I shook my head. "What stories?" He gestured to the forest. "People say the devil himself roams these woods, luring campers to this exact spot. He tempts them, tests them, some leave, most don't." "That's ridiculous," I said, forcing a laugh. But the way Nathan's eyes lingered on mine made me shiver. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the RV felt heavy, stifling. I opened the door to let in some air and froze. Standing in the clearing was my ex-boyfriend, Mark. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft and pleading. "I made a mistake. Come back." My heart pounded. I knew it wasn't real. Mark couldn't possibly be here. But the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, made me want to believe it. I stepped toward him, and the illusion shattered. His face twisted, his eyes hollowing out, and he dissolved into the shadows. Nathan returned the next night, sitting by the fire like he belonged there. "You're stubborn," he said. His voice light but edged with something darker. "Most people give in by now." "Give in to what?" I snapped. "To me," he said simply, and his face shifted. His warm smile grew wider, sharper, until it was something inhuman. His eyes gleamed with fire. "You've heard the stories. You know who I am." I backed away, my heart racing. "This isn't real. You're not real." "Real enough." He stood, towering over me. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted, Sarah. Fame, fortune, love, all of it. All you have to do is stay. And if I don't?" Nathan's smile faded. "Then you'll leave empty-handed. If you leave at all." That night, the forest came alive. The RV rocked violently as something clawed at the walls. Shadows swirled outside, their laughter echoing in the night. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the door open, determined to face whatever was out there. Nathan stood in the clearing, his body now fully transformed. His horns curled toward the sky, his skin glistening like molten rock. "Last chance," he growled. I screamed, hurling the flashlight at him and running into the woods. The forest was a maze of darkness, every tree looking the same. The laughter followed me, joined by whispers in my own voice. "You'll never make it. Just give up." I stumbled into a clearing and there was Elliot, waiting with his rifle. "Told you to leave," he muttered, firing a shot into the shadows. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, the forest was silent. He didn't explain how he knew to find me. He just led me back to my RV and stood guard as I packed up and drove away. I left Devil's Den behind, but it never really left me. The photos I took of the deer, the campsite, even Elliot, Nathan was in every single one, standing just out of focus. I deleted my blog post about the park. Some places are better left alone, and sometimes the devil's deal is just waiting for you to come back. My name is Marcus Calloway, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in early May during what should have been a simple solo camping trip for work. I'm a wildlife photographer, and I've spent countless nights alone in forests all across the country. But what I encountered in the Allegheny National Forest that week, it wasn't anything I could capture on film or explain in words, not completely. Still, I'll try. I'd chosen this location for its isolation. Deep in the woods, miles from the nearest trailhead, there was a small lake where I hoped to catch sight of a bobcat or maybe even a black bear. Those kinds of photos could make or break the submission I was preparing for a prestigious competition. I arrived mid-afternoon, parking my RV in a clearing near the lake. The spot was perfect, secluded, scenic, and most importantly, quiet. too quiet, I'd later realize. I spent the first evening setting up. My leg, a souvenir from a rock climbing accident 3 years ago, slowed me down, but I managed. The injury wasn't just physical, it had gutted my confidence, my belief that I could still do the things I loved. This trip was supposed to be proof, to myself more than anyone, that I hadn't lost everything. The first night passed without incident. I slept soundly, lulled by the stillness of the forest. If only it had stayed that way. The second morning, I found footprints near my campsite. At first, I assumed they were mine. I'd walked around the area plenty the day before, but these were larger than my boots and spaced in a way that didn't match my stride. They circled the RV, leading toward the lake, then disappearing into the woods. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker had wandered through before I arrived. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That evening, I set up my camera gear near the lake, hoping for a glimpse of wildlife. The forest felt heavier than before, the silence more pronounced. Even the frogs and crickets seemed to hold their breath. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. Then, as the sun dipped below the tree line, I saw it, or rather, me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Across the lake, partially hidden by the trees, stood a figure wearing my jacket, my hat, even my boots. My heart raced as I squinted through the dim light, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Grabbing my camera, I aimed the lens and zoomed in. The figure was gone. I told myself it was nothing, a shadow, a trick of my tired eyes. Still, I packed up quickly and returned to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I slept with my flashlight in hand. The next day, I drove into a nearby town to stock up on supplies. At the general store, I met Jessie Harper, a folklorist who overheard me asking about the lake. "You're camping out there alone?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Jessie was in her 40s, her graying hair tied back in a ponytail. "You should be careful. That place has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, then leaned in. "The locals call them the Hollow Ones, spirits that mimic people, lure them deeper into the woods. They say if you listen to them long enough, they take something from you. Your voice, your face, maybe even your soul." I forced a laugh. "Sounds like a great story for a campfire." Jessie didn't smile. "It's not just a story." That evening, I returned to the campsite, determined to finish the shoot and leave by morning. As I unloaded my gear, I realized something was missing: my flashlight. I searched the RV, convinced I'd misplaced it, but it was gone. When I stepped outside, there it was, sitting on a rock at the edge of the lake, as if someone had placed it there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but pride, or maybe stupidity, kept me rooted. I grabbed the flashlight and returned to the RV. Later that night, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. As I scrolled through the shots of the lake, one image froze me. In the background, partially hidden among the trees, was a figure. It looked like me. The mimic's presence became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the figure in the photos. I started hearing things. Footsteps outside the RV, whispers that sounded like my own voice, calling my name. My supplies were moved, items appearing in places I hadn't left them. One night, I set up a motion-triggered camera outside, hoping to catch whatever, or whoever, was messing with me. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. At 3:12 a.m., the camera captured a figure walking past the RV. It was me, or something that looked like me. Only, I hadn't left the RV that night. The final night, everything escalated. The forest came alive with noise, branches snapping, whispers growing louder. laughter that echoed from nowhere and everywhere. I sat in the RV, clutching my camera like a shield, as the mimic's voice surrounded me. "Marcus," it called, in my voice. "Come outside." When I didn't move, the mimic appeared in the window, its face an exact replica of mine. It smiled, but the expression was wrong. Too wide, too sharp. Then it started to scratch words into the RV door with a branch. "You are already hollow." Desperation took over. I grabbed my most prized possession, a photograph of me standing at the summit of a mountain, taken before my accident, and tossed it into the fire pit outside. The mimic screamed, a sound that was both mine and not, before vanishing into the trees. As dawn broke, I packed up and left, driving until the forest disappeared in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached home. The mimic hasn't followed me, not physically anyway. But sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something in my reflection. A faint smile that isn't mine. And when I review my photos from that trip, the mimic is always there, hiding in the background, waiting. My name is Kara Walsh, and I'm 34 years old. I've spent the past 5 years traveling the country, writing stories for adventure blogs and magazines. What happened to me a few weeks ago at Ricketts Glen State Park in Pennsylvania was supposed to be just another assignment, another notch on my belt. But it turned into something I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. It started when I rented an old RV for a solo trip. My editor had asked for a Halloween-themed piece about haunted camping destinations, and Ricketts Glen, with its dark history and local ghost stories, was a perfect fit. I'd heard the rumors, ghostly children wandering the trails, voices calling out at night, and strange happenings near Lake Jean. It sounded like the kind of spooky folklore that would get clicks. I was intrigued, sure, but I didn't believe a word of it. Not yet. I rolled into the park mid-morning, the RV rattling as I pulled into the camping area near Lake Jean. The place was beautiful. Golden autumn leaves reflected on the water, and the crisp air carried the earthy scent of fallen foliage. The lake stretched out like glass, utterly still, its surface so calm it felt unnatural. At the visitor center, I grabbed a trail map and chatted with the staff. When I mentioned camping near the lake, their smiles stiffened. "Be careful out there," one of them said, "and don't wander too close to the water after dark." "Why not?" I asked, curious but amused. "Is this about the ghost stories?" "Something like that," she muttered, avoiding my gaze. I brushed it off as small-town superstition and headed back to my RV. The warnings only made me more eager to dig into the legends. If I could capture the park's eerie charm in my writing, I knew it would make for a killer story. After hiking the Falls Trail during the day, a breathtaking but grueling climb past cascading waterfalls, I returned to my campsite by the lake. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, and a faint mist began creeping along the shoreline. As I sat by the campfire jotting notes in my journal, I noticed something strange. The woods had gone silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the crackle of the fire and the faint lapping of water. A chill prickled the back of my neck. Then I heard it. A child's laughter, faint and distant, carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, closer this time. Standing, I shone my flashlight toward the lake but saw nothing. Still, the laughter continued, fading in and out like a radio struggling for signal. I told myself it was my imagination, tired nerves playing tricks after a long day. But when I returned to the RV, I found something that made my stomach drop. Tiny, wet footprints dotted the ground near my door, leading from the lake to the RV. They ended abruptly, as though whoever made them had vanished into thin air. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. It was probably a prank, I told myself. Maybe some kids from another campsite messing around. Determined to stay on track, I decided to explore the area around the lake. That's when I saw him. A little boy, no older than 8, standing near the water's edge. His clothes were soaked, and he clutched a tattered teddy bear to his chest. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stared at the water like he was waiting for something. "Hey, kid," I called, walking toward him. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" He turned to look at me then, his eyes wide and hollow. For a moment he opened his mouth like he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the woods behind me. When I turned back, he was gone. I returned to the visitor center that afternoon, shaken. That's where I met Mrs. Cleary, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with silver hair tied in a braid. She was restocking brochures when she noticed me lingering. "You look like you've seen something," she said, her voice low and knowing. I hesitated, then told her about the boy. Her expression darkened. "You shouldn't be camping by the lake," she said. "Not at this time of year." "Why not?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Mrs. Cleary sighed, pulling a chair next to mine. Decades ago, there was a summer camp near Lake Jean. One night, during a storm, a group of children went out on the water in a rowboat. They never came back. The storm capsized the boat, and their bodies were never recovered. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. And people think, what? Their spirits haunt the lake? "It's more than that," she said, leaning closer. "The lake isn't just haunted, it's cursed. Something dark lives in those waters, something that keeps those children trapped, tethered to this place, and it doesn't like visitors." That night, I couldn't sleep. Mrs. Cleary's story swirled in my mind as I lay in the RV, listening to the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. Around midnight, I heard it again. The laughter, closer this time. Then came the voices. "Kara," they whispered, barely audible over the breeze. "Help us." My blood turned to ice. Sitting up, I peeked out the RV window and saw them. The boy from earlier and 3 other children, standing in a line near the water. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. "What do you want?" I called, my voice shaking. The boy raised his hand, pointing toward the woods again. "This way," he whispered, his voice distant and hollow. Against all logic, I followed. The boy led me deep into the forest, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the mist. Eventually, we came to a clearing. Old, rusted camping equipment lay scattered around. A collapsed tent, a dented kettle, and rotting wooden planks arranged in a fire pit. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. Etched into the rocks surrounding the site were crude drawings, stick figures of children, and a towering shape rising from the lake. My heart raced as I pieced it together. This was the campsite of the missing campers, the children who had drowned. Suddenly, the boy turned to face me, his expression frantic. "It's coming," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, the temperature plummeted, and the forest fell silent. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the direction of the lake. The mist thickened, swirling around me as I backed away. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, twisted, and dripping with black water. Its body was made of shifting shapes, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was a void, an empty darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of my mind. The boy grabbed my hand. "Run!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the still air. I sprinted through the forest, the boy leading the way. Behind us, the spirit let out an ear-splitting wail, a sound that made the trees shudder and my knees buckle. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on the boy's hand in mine. We stopped at a crumbling stone altar, moss-covered and ancient. On it sat a rotting wooden totem, carved with the same stick-figure children I'd seen earlier. "The totem," the boy gasped. "Burn it!" My hands trembled as I struck a match, holding the flame to the damp wood. For a moment nothing happened, but then the totem caught fire, burning with an unnatural blue light. The spirit screamed, its form writhing and distorting as the fire consumed the totem. The boy and the other children stood silently, their faces calm for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered, as the spirit dissolved into the mist. One by one, the children faded too, their laughter echoing faintly as they disappeared. I stumbled back to the RV at dawn, exhausted and shaken. The lake was calm again, its surface reflecting the rising sun. I wrote my article, but I left out the real details. Some stories are too dangerous to tell. If you ever camp near Lake Jean, listen to the locals. And if you hear a child's laughter at night, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. My name is Ben Holloway, and I'm 36 years old. I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade, traveling to some of the most remote and breathtaking places in the country. But no experience has ever come close to what happened to me at Black Moshannon State Park in Pennsylvania. It was supposed to be a quiet, solo trip to capture images of the park's unique wildlife. Instead, it became something I can't fully explain, something I'll carry with me forever. I arrived at Black Moshannon in mid-October. The leaves had turned golden, the air carried a sharp chill, and the park was nearly empty, just the way I liked it. I'd been working on a photo book about Pennsylvania's wilderness, and the park's boggy wetlands promised rare birds and other elusive creatures I hadn't yet captured. My RV, an old but reliable 1987 Winnebago, served as my base for the trip. I parked near the edge of the bog, a quiet spot surrounded by trees and thick brush. The swampy smell of decomposing vegetation hit me as I stepped out, but I didn't mind. This was exactly the isolation I needed. As I set up my gear, I noticed something odd. Carved into a nearby tree were strange symbols, spirals and jagged runes I didn't recognize. They were intricate, almost deliberate, as if someone had spent hours crafting them. Probably some bored camper or a local with a flair for the dramatic, I thought. I brushed it off and focused on scouting the area. By dusk, I'd found a promising spot to photograph nocturnal creatures and returned to the RV to prepare for the night. While I was refilling my water bottle at the park's visitor center earlier in the day, I met a woman named Sylvia. She was in her 40s, with sharp green eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair. She struck me as one of those locals who'd lived in the area forever. "Out here alone?" she asked, eyeing my camera gear. "Yeah," I said, not eager for small talk, just doing some wildlife photography. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Be careful where you wander, especially after dark." "Why's that?" I asked, sensing a story. She leaned in slightly. "This bog has a history. Not all of it's good. People talk about the witches, 3 sisters accused of dark magic, executed right here in Black Moshannon. They say their spirits linger in the swamp, luring people who stray too far. Most never come back." I smiled politely, trying not to roll my eyes. I'd heard my fair share of ghost stories, and they were all the same, exaggerated tales meant to scare campers. Sylvia must have noticed my skepticism. "Believe what you want," she said, her tone cool, "but don't ignore the signs." I shrugged off her warning. Ghost stories weren't going to stop me from getting my shots. That evening, I headed into the bog, my camera slung over my shoulder. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mud and decaying leaves. A thick fog began rolling in as the sun set, clinging to the ground like a living thing. I set up near a cluster of dead trees that jutted out of the water, their skeletal branches silhouetted against the last light of day. The swamp was eerily quiet. Even the usual croaks of frogs and rustling of small creatures were absent. As I adjusted my lens, I heard something. Faint whispers, just barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. I froze, straining to listen. The whispers came again, indistinct but unmistakable. They seemed to drift through the fog, carried on the still air. Probably just the wind, I muttered, though the hairs on my arms stood on end. When I returned to the RV later that night, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. At first, they seemed normal, stunning even. But then I noticed something strange. In the background of several shots, faint shapes lingered in the mist. They looked like figures, tall and thin, with elongated limbs, but they were translucent, almost impossible to make out. I frowned, zooming in on one of the images. The shapes weren't there when I took the photos. They couldn't be. A sharp knock on the RV door made me jump. My heart pounding, I peered through the window but saw nothing. When I opened the door, the fog seemed thicker, pressing against the edge of my campsite. The air felt colder, heavier. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. The next day, I ventured deeper into the swamp, determined to shake off the unease. I told myself the whispers and shapes in the photos were tricks of the light, or my overactive imagination. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. While wading through knee-deep water to photograph a heron, I saw her. At first, I thought it was my ex-wife, Claire, standing on the edge of the bog. She was wearing the same green jacket she used to love, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. "Claire," I called, my voice cracking. She turned and smiled at me, a smile I hadn't seen in years. Then she stepped into the mist and disappeared. I scrambled after her, the mud sucking at my boots. "Claire, wait!" When I reached the spot where she'd been, there was no trace of her, just more fog and the faint sound of laughter, echoing from somewhere deeper in the swamp. That night, I got lost in the fog. The trail markers I'd been following vanished, leaving me disoriented. My flashlight barely penetrated the mist, and every sound seemed amplified. Branches snapping, water dripping, whispers swirling around me. Eventually, I stumbled upon an old, crumbling cabin. Its roof had caved in and moss covered the walls. Inside, I found a journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The entries were scrawled in shaky handwriting, detailing the story of 3 sisters accused of witchcraft by settlers. They'd been dragged into the swamp, tied to trees, and burned alive. The writer claimed their dying screams cursed the land, binding their spirits to the bog. One line stood out, scrawled over and over, "Do not trust the fog. It lies." As I left the cabin, the fog thickened again, swallowing the trail. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Then I saw them. 3 figures emerging from the mist. They were women, but barely. Their forms shifted and twisted, their faces pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly. Their limbs were unnaturally long, their fingers ending in claws that dragged through the mud. One of them stepped closer, her voice like 1,000 echoes. "Stay with us, Ben. You've lost so much. Let us ease your pain." I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want?" Another one laughed, the sound high and sharp. "We want what was taken. Life, freedom, yours." I ran, the witches gliding through the fog behind me. Their laughter filled the air, mingling with the sound of my own panicked breaths. The journal's warning echoed in my mind. Do not trust the fog. When one of them appeared in front of me, blocking my path, I remembered Sylvia's herbs. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the small bundle she'd given me. I struck a match and held the flame to the herbs, creating a plume of acrid smoke. The witch recoiled, hissing like a snake, before vanishing into the mist. Using the smoke as a shield, I made my way back to the RV, lighting more herbs whenever the witches came too close. Their screams of rage followed me the entire way. Back at the RV, I found Sylvia waiting, her face pale but calm. "You saw them," she said. It wasn't a question. "They're real," I whispered, my voice trembling. She nodded. "And they're bound to this place. They won't stop until you leave, or until you join them." With Sylvia's help, I performed a ritual to banish the witches temporarily, burning the journal along with the remaining herbs. As the flames consumed the pages, the fog lifted, and the witches' screams faded into silence. I left Black Moshannon the next morning, vowing never to return. My photos from the trip were stunning, but I couldn't bring myself to publish them. Every time I looked at them, I saw the faint shapes of the witches in the background, watching, waiting. Even now, I can still hear their whispers when the night is quiet. My name is Aaron Taylor, and I'm 28 years old. I've always loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, just being in nature, it's my escape from a life spent staring at computer screens. But what happened to me last October in Laurel Hill State Park changed the way I see those quiet, serene woods forever. It started with a simple plan, a weekend trip with my best friend Cassie Grant. Cassie and I had been inseparable growing up, but as we got older, life pulled us in different directions. She became a nurse, and I worked as a graphic designer, so we rarely saw each other. This trip was supposed to bring us back to those carefree days when it was just us against the world. We picked Laurel Hill State Park because it was close to where we used to hike as kids. The crisp autumn air, the vibrant reds and yellows of the trees, it was the perfect place to reconnect. We packed up my old RV and headed out on a Friday afternoon, full of excitement. By the time we reached the far edge of the park, the sun was setting. Our chosen campsite was remote, tucked away near the Hemlock Trail. There was no one else around, just the hum of the forest and the occasional bird call. It felt perfect, at least at first. As we unpacked, I realized I'd forgotten the tent poles at home. Cassie laughed at my frustration, shrugging it off. "Guess we'll have to rough it with the tarp," she said, pulling it out of the bag. We strung the tarp between two trees as a backup shelter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The RV heater had also been acting up, so the first night was colder than I'd expected. Still, we sat by the fire roasting marshmallows and joking like we used to. It felt good, familiar. But as the fire died down, I thought I heard something. Faint giggling, carried on the wind. I froze, straining my ears. Cassie noticed my expression and smirked. "Relax, Aaron. Probably just some campers down the trail." I wanted to believe her, but the sound felt too close, too deliberate. When I went to bed that night, I left the RV windows cracked, listening to the night. The next morning, we decided to hike the Hemlock Trail, a popular loop with stunning views of the surrounding forest. The crisp air and the crunch of leaves underfoot were invigorating, and for a while, it was just us and the trail. Then we stumbled upon it. An abandoned campsite. It looked ancient. Rusted metal chairs sat at odd angles around a collapsed fire pit, and a tattered tarp hung from a tree, its edges frayed and weathered. Scattered among the debris were toys, an old doll with missing eyes, a wooden train, and a jack-in-the-box with faded paint. Cassie, being Cassie, walked straight to the jack-in-the-box. "What do you think, creepy or quaint?" she asked, twisting the handle with a mischievous grin. "Don't," I said sharply, but it was too late. The box let out a series of tinny, discordant notes before the clown popped out with a metallic snap. I shivered. Cassie laughed. "Come on, Aaron, it's just junk." But as we left the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, we sat by the fire again, but the mood was different. I kept glancing into the dark woods, half expecting to see something staring back. Cassie teased me for being jumpy, but even she seemed uneasy. When we finally went to bed, I felt too restless to sleep. Around midnight, I heard it again, giggling, clearer this time. It was faint but distinct, like a group of children playing just beyond the RV. I sat up, heart pounding. "Cassie, wake up," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. She groaned. "Aaron, it's nothing. Go to sleep." But the next morning, we found something that neither of us could explain. Circling the RV and the fire pit were small footprints, like those of a child. They shouldn't have been there. We were miles from the nearest family campsite, and the prints were too small for any animals in the area. "They're probably just from some kids who wandered by," Cassie said, though her voice wavered. "Last night?" I asked, "in the middle of nowhere, without leaving any other tracks?" Cassie didn't answer. That afternoon, we decided to explore the area around the abandoned campsite again, hoping to find an explanation for the footprints. While Cassie examined the toys, I wandered a little deeper into the woods and found something tucked into the roots of an old tree. A diary. It was small, leather-bound, and brittle with age. The first few pages were too faded to read, but the later entries were clearer. They were written by a young girl named Lila, who lived in a logging camp near the park in the late 1800s. Lila wrote about her friends, the games they played, and the harsh conditions of the camp. But the entries grew darker as they went on. She described a man with the knife who would visit the camp at night, taking children away. Her last entry was short and chilling. "The man is here again. He says it's my turn." That night, the whispers returned, louder and closer than before. The RV's windows fogged up from the inside, and small handprints appeared on the glass. Cassie was starting to panic now, her usual bravado gone. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," she said, pacing the RV. "It was never funny," I snapped. Then Cassie screamed. I turned to see her staring at the bathroom mirror, where her reflection was smiling, wide and unnatural, even though her real face was frozen in terror. The lights flickered, and the giggling turned into shrieks. We tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "We have to get out of here," Cassie said, her voice shaking. I clutched the diary, flipping through its pages desperately. If these children were haunting us, there had to be a way to stop them. Following the whispers, we ended up back at the abandoned campsite. Cassie was trembling, clinging to my arm, as we entered the clearing. The air was heavy, electric, and the toys seemed to be arranged differently, forming a circle around the fire pit. The giggling grew louder, echoing all around us. Then they appeared. Spectral children, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes black pits. They surrounded us, staring with silent intensity. Cassie began to sob, and one of the children stepped forward, a little girl holding a broken doll. It was Lila. "You can't stay here," I said, my voice shaking. "You need to move on." The children didn't respond, but Lila pointed to the diary in my hands. I realized what I had to do. Using a match from my pocket, I lit the diary on fire and placed it in the fire pit. As the pages burned, the children began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night. When it was over, the woods were silent again. Cassie and I stumbled back to the RV, shaken but alive. This time, the engine started without a hitch, and we drove out of the park without looking back. I still have nightmares about those children. I see Lila in my dreams, standing silently at the edge of my bed. I don't know if I really freed them or just unleashed something worse, but one thing's for sure, I'll never camp in Laurel Hill State Park again. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I was 29 when this happened. It was early October, and I just quit my job after months of burnout. Software development had consumed my life, leaving me feeling hollow and aimless. I thought a week away from everything would help me clear my head, so I rented a small RV and headed into the wilderness of Pennsylvania's Michaud State Forest. I picked a remote area called Devil's Hollow, partly because the name intrigued me, and partly because it was so far off the grid that I wouldn't have to deal with other people. That was the whole point. Just me, the forest, and some time to think. The drive was uneventful until I turned onto the dirt road that led to Devil's Hollow. The forest seemed to close in as I drove deeper, the trees arching overhead like a cathedral ceiling. By the time I reached the small clearing I'd picked for my campsite, it was late afternoon, and the golden light filtering through the trees did little to ease the eerie quiet. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects. Just silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I parked the RV, stepped outside, and stretched. The air was sharp with the smell of pine and damp earth. After setting up a small fire pit and unrolling a camp chair, I grabbed a beer from the RV and sat outside, letting the silence wrap around me. It felt unnatural, but I told myself I was just adjusting to being so far from civilization. That was when I noticed the symbol. It was carved into the trunk of a tree near the edge of the clearing. An inverted triangle with a single slash running through the middle. The lines were crude but deep, as though someone had gouged them into the bark with a hunting knife. I ran my fingers over the grooves, wondering if it was a marker or some kind of graffiti. It didn't look like anything I'd seen before, but I shrugged it off. People did all sorts of weird things in the woods. Maybe it was some amateur artist's attempt at being edgy. Still, it stuck in my mind as the evening wore on. That night, I lay in the small bed at the back of the RV, the quiet pressing against the thin walls like a physical weight. Around midnight, I woke to a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the RV. But the sound moved, scratching first at the side of the vehicle, then at the back, then near the door. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark interior of the RV as I crept to the door. I hesitated, listening. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a deeper silence that made my skin crawl. I flung the door open and shone the light outside. Nothing. Just the fire pit, now a smoldering pile of ashes, and the shadowy outline of trees against the night sky. "Raccoons," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. I shut the door and locked it, double-checking the latch before crawling back into bed. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore the area. There was supposed to be a stream not far from the campsite, and I figured a hike would clear my head. I grabbed a water bottle and set out, marking my path with small strips of cloth tied to branches, just in case I got turned around. The forest felt different during the day, less suffocating but still unnervingly quiet. As I followed the faint trail toward the stream, I noticed more of the strange symbols carved into trees, always the same design. The inverted triangle with the slash. About halfway to the stream, I saw him. He was standing just off the trail, a thin man in a green jacket and jeans. His face was pale, almost sickly, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed too large for his narrow face. At first, I thought he might be a park ranger, but there were no patches or insignias on his jacket. He didn't carry any gear, no backpack, no map, nothing. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and flat. I stopped in my tracks. "What?" "It's not safe," he continued, his eyes boring into mine. "The forest doesn't like strangers. You should leave before dark." I opened my mouth to respond, but he turned and walked into the trees, disappearing so quickly it was like he'd evaporated. I stood there for a long moment, the silence around me broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. My instinct was to follow him, to demand an explanation, but something about the encounter left me cold with dread. I turned back toward camp, the stream forgotten. By the time I returned to the RV, the afternoon light was already fading. I sat outside for a while, replaying the man's warning in my mind. It wasn't just what he'd said, it was how he'd said it, like he knew something I didn't. When I finally stepped back into the RV, I froze. My journal, which I'd left on the table, was now lying on the floor. My flashlight, which had been by the bed, was propped upright on the counter. I hadn't left them like that, I was sure of it. But I was alone. I had been alone all day. Trying to shake off the unease, I cleaned up the mess and cooked a simple dinner. I told myself I was imagining things. Stress could play tricks on your mind, couldn't it? But when I stepped outside again, I saw the symbol carved into another tree, this one much closer to the RV. That night, I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, they were faint, like wind slipping through the trees. But as I lay there, frozen, they grew louder, more distinct. Voices murmured my name, interspersed with words I couldn't understand. They weren't coming from outside, they were inside the RV. My chest tightened, and I clutched the flashlight, flicking it on as I scanned the interior. The voices stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. Then the RV door creaked open. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing, and slammed the door shut. The lock was still latched, but it hadn't stopped the door from opening. I bolted it again, leaning against the cold metal, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Something was out there, something that wanted me to know it was there. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever peace I'd been hoping to find in Devil's Hollow was clearly not going to happen. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic set in. I checked the gas tank, full. The battery was fine. There was no reason it shouldn't work. I grabbed my bag and decided to hike back to the main road. The sooner I got out of the forest, the better. But as I retraced my steps, the trail seemed different. The strips of cloth I'd tied to branches were gone, and landmarks I'd passed on the way in had vanished. The forest was changing around me. I pushed forward, trying to ignore the whispers that drifted through the trees, growing louder with each step. Then I heard my own voice. "Ethan!" I stopped dead, my blood turning cold. The voice was unmistakable. My voice, calling my name from deeper in the forest. "Help me," it said, soft and pleading. I turned and ran, no longer caring about the trail or the road. I just needed to get away. As dusk fell, I stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an old, rusted metal box. Inside, I found a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The final entry read, "It knows my name. I see it watching me from the trees. I can't escape." A chill ran down my spine, and I looked up to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and shadowy, its glowing red eyes cutting through the dim light. The Watcher. It stepped closer, its form flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. The whispers in my head grew deafening, twisting my thoughts, feeding on my fear. I stumbled backward, clutching the journal like a talisman. Desperate, I grabbed my laptop from my bag and turned the screen's brightness to max, shining it toward the figure. The light seemed to burn it, the shadows recoiling as the whispers turned to a shriek. I ran, the laptop clutched in one hand, the journal in the other. By some miracle, I found my way back to the RV. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I sped out of Devil's Hollow without looking back. I haven't been back to the forest since. But sometimes, late at night, I see the symbol scratched into my apartment wall, and I hear the whispers, faint but insistent, reminding me that the Watcher is still out there, and it hasn't forgotten my name. My name is Laura Bennett, and I was 34 when this happened. It was early October, just after my divorce was finalized, when I decided to take my first solo camping trip in an RV. The idea had been swirling in my mind for months, a way to reclaim my independence and prove to myself that I didn't need anyone else to define me. So, I bought a modest RV and headed to Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, a place I'd read about in a travel blog. I parked at a quiet, secluded campsite near Minister Creek Trail. The trees around me stretched high and dense, their tops barely letting the late afternoon sunlight reach the forest floor. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so, and I thought maybe I'd finally found the serenity I'd been searching for. The first night started innocently enough. I set up a small fire outside the RV, heating a can of soup while the forest around me came alive with the soft hum of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I allowed myself to relax for the first time in what felt like years. Then the tapping started. At first, I thought it was nothing. A branch falling, maybe, or some small animal skittering across the roof of the RV. But the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the side of the vehicle nearest to the trees. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth as the sound moved from one side of the RV to the other. Probably just raccoons, I muttered to myself, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Gripping my flashlight, I stepped outside and shone the beam around the campsite. The fire cast long flickering shadows, but nothing moved beyond the trees. I stood there for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet now, too quiet. I went back inside, double-checking that the door was locked. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But the tapping stayed with me, like an itch at the back of my mind. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore the nearby trail. The crisp air and sunlight filtering through the trees helped ease my nerves. As I hiked, I kept an eye out for wildlife, occasionally snapping pictures with my phone. I almost felt normal again, almost. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the trail, just where the trees grew thickest. A thin man in a worn green jacket, his face partially obscured by the brim of a battered hat. At first, I thought he might be a park ranger, but there were no insignias on his jacket, no gear or tools that a ranger might carry. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and flat. Sorry," I stammered, unsure of what he meant. "It's not safe," he continued, stepping closer. His face came into view, pale and weathered, with the dark, sunken eyes. "The forest doesn't like strangers. You should leave before dark." I opened my mouth to respond, but he turned and disappeared into the trees, moving so quickly and silently that it was as if he'd never been there at all. I stood there for a long moment, the words replaying in my mind. The forest doesn't like strangers. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, the result of that strange man's warning, but every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves felt amplified, like the forest was alive and aware of my presence. That night, the tapping returned. It started around midnight, louder this time, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to drift through the air. I pressed my ear to the RV wall, straining to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, slipping through my mind like smoke. The whispers grew louder, and then I heard my name. Laura. I froze, my heart hammering. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it came from outside the RV. Gripping the flashlight, I peered out the small window. Nothing moved except the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Laura, come outside, the voice said again, closer this time. I backed away from the window, shaking. My first instinct was to call someone, but my phone had no signal this deep in the forest. I locked the RV door and sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, circling the RV before fading into silence just before dawn. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things and planned to leave, but as I started the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but it wouldn't start. Panic bubbled in my chest. I checked the gas tank. It was full. There was no reason it shouldn't work. Frustrated and unnerved, I decided to hike to the nearest ranger station for help. I marked my path carefully, tying strips of cloth to branches as I went. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more disoriented I became. The trail seemed to shift, the trees blending together in an endless sea of green. And then I heard it. Laura. The voice drifted through the trees, familiar and yet wrong. It was my ex-husband's voice, soft and pleading. Laura, I'm sorry. Come back. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse racing. He wasn't here, he couldn't be. But the voice sounded so real, so desperate. Against my better judgment, I called out, David, is that you? The forest answered with silence. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard faint laughter, childlike and chilling. I turned, but saw nothing. The laughter grew louder, joined by the whispering voices from the night before. They seemed to surround me, pulling me deeper into the woods. By the time I stumbled upon the old logging camp, the sun was sinking low, casting the ruins in an eerie orange glow. The air smelled of smoke and ash, though there was no fire in sight. Scorched tree stumps and rusted equipment littered the area, and in the center stood a massive logging saw half buried in the ground. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single voice, my own voice. Laura, it said, coming from the saw itself, you've always been alone. I stepped back, trembling, but the shadows around me began to shift. Figures emerged from the trees, thin, ghostly shapes with glowing eyes and charred skin. The whisperers. They closed in slowly, their whispers filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. I felt my knees buckle, my body frozen as the voices tore at my mind, feeding on my fears and doubts. You're nothing without him, one voice hissed. You'll never escape, another whispered. Desperate, I fumbled for the emergency flare in my pocket. My hands shook as I struck it, the bright red light cutting through the darkness. The whisperers recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke as the light burned brighter. I stumbled back toward the forest, the flare guiding my way. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. My legs ached and my lungs burned, but the sight of the vehicle brought a wave of relief. I climbed inside, slamming the door behind me. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I didn't look back as I sped down the narrow forest road, the trees blurring past. I reported what happened to a park ranger, but he just gave me a skeptical look and told me about the old legend of the logging campfire. According to him, several workers had died in the blaze, and their spirits were said to haunt the area, luring campers to their doom. I don't camp anymore. I sold the RV a week later and moved into an apartment closer to the city. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers outside my window calling my name. and I wonder if I truly escaped or if the whisperers are still out there waiting. My name is Adam Rosenthal, and I was 24 when this happened. It was late October, just when the Pennsylvania woods begin to shed their fiery colors and settle into the cold, barren grip of early winter. My best friend Josh and I decided to take a weekend camping trip to Hickory Run State Park. It was his idea, a break from our city routines, he said. He loved the outdoors and claimed it was his way of recharging. I didn't have much of a connection with nature, but I went along with it. I figured it would be good to get away, bond, and face my uneasiness with the wilderness. We drove up from Pittsburgh in Josh's battered Subaru, stopping along the way for gas station snacks and a cheap flashlight that would later turn out to be our first mistake. By the time we reached the park, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the dense forest. Josh, ever confident and annoyingly carefree, insisted we hike a few miles off the marked trail to find a perfect spot for our tent. "Trust me, Adam, you don't experience real camping unless you get off the beaten path," he said with his usual grin. I grumbled something about staying close to the car, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. I was already nervous. The forest seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. We found a clearing just before nightfall. It was surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the cold wind, their tops disappearing into the twilight sky. The tent went up quickly, though Josh laughed when I struggled with the poles. "City boy," he teased, slapping my back. We made a small fire and cooked some hot dogs we'd brought, the greasy smell mingling with the sharp, earthy scent of the forest. For a while, it was pleasant. The crackling fire, the occasional rustle of leaves, it felt like what camping should be. But as the night deepened, the uneasiness returned. It started with the sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a series of rhythmic clicking noises echoed through the trees. I paused, my hot dog halfway to my mouth. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Josh shrugged. "Probably just deer or something. Relax." I tried to convince myself he was right, but the sound didn't feel natural. It was too consistent, too deliberate. Every few minutes it would start again, always from a different direction. It was like the forest was alive and shifting around us. When we finally turned in for the night, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. The clicking continued, closer now. Josh was already snoring beside me, oblivious. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold. Josh, of course, was already up and bustling around the camp like we were in some kind of wilderness survival show. "Come on, Adam, let's explore Boulder Field," he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. I groaned, but followed. The hike was grueling, and Josh's old map didn't match the terrain. The trails were overgrown, forcing us to push through brambles and slippery rocks. At one point, my backpack ripped, spilling its contents onto the damp ground. Josh just laughed. "Told you to pack light, man." By the time we reached Boulder Field, the sun was high overhead, but its light did little to warm us. The field stretched out like a frozen sea, the massive rocks piled haphazardly in every direction. It was eerie, silent except for the occasional creak of a shifting stone underfoot. That's when we found the tracks. They were massive, human-like footprints, but elongated, with clawed toes that dug deep into the mud at the edge of the rocks. They led into the field but vanished abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply stopped walking or leapt away. Josh crouched to examine them, his eyes alight with curiosity. Maybe a bear or someone pulling a prank. "Bears don't have feet like that," I said, my voice tight. He shrugged again, as if it wasn't worth worrying about. "Let's head back. It's probably nothing." Back at camp, the wind picked up, making the fire sputter and struggle. We ate in silence, the tension between us growing. Josh was brushing off the tracks like they were a joke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the sounds returned. Clicking, snapping, and now faint whispers that seemed to float on the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just Josh playing a trick on me, but when I turned to confront him, he was fast asleep. Then I heard it, my own voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from somewhere in the forest. "Adam," it said, distorted and drawn out. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding. I knew it wasn't Josh. The voice was wrong, hollow, like it was coming through a broken speaker. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the malfunctioning flashlight like it could somehow protect me. The next morning, Josh was still dismissive. I told him about the voice, about the clicking and whispers, but he just laughed. "Man, you've been watching too many horror movies," he said, packing up his gear. "We'll hike out today, okay? Just chill." But as we were breaking camp, the forest grew silent again. No birds, no wind, nothing but the sound of our footsteps on the damp earth. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard the voice again. "Help me." Josh froze this time, his face pale. It was my voice, and it was coming from the direction of Boulder Field. "Okay," he said, trying to smile but failing. That was weird. He grabbed the flashlight and walked toward the sound. "Stay here," he said before I could stop him. "Josh, don't," I started, but he was already gone. I waited for what felt like hours, but Josh didn't return. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming taller, their branches like skeletal fingers. The clicking was back, louder now, surrounding the camp. When I couldn't take it anymore, I grabbed the emergency flare from Josh's bag and followed his trail. I found his flashlight lying near a patch of overturned rocks, but no sign of him. The tracks were back, deeper this time, leading into the trees. "Josh!" I yelled, my voice breaking. The forest swallowed the sound. Then I saw it. A tall, emaciated figure stepped out from the shadows. Its limbs were impossibly long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Antlers jutted from its skull, and its eyes glowed like embers. The smell hit me next, a foul mix of decay and blood. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and spoke. "Help me!" it said, in Josh's voice. I stumbled back, raising the flare like a weapon. The creature lunged, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I screamed and fired the flare. The red light exploded in the darkness, hitting its side. The wendigo let out a guttural scream, retreating into the trees as the flare sputtered out. I ran. I don't remember how long or in what direction, but I ran until my legs gave out. By some miracle, I found the marked trail and followed it back to the park entrance. A group of rangers found me there at dawn, shaking and incoherent. They searched the woods for Josh, but they didn't find him. All they found was his flashlight and a torn piece of his jacket near Boulder Field. The official report said animal attack, but I know the truth. Something else lives in those woods, something ancient and hungry. I'll never go back. Even now, in the safety of my apartment, I sometimes hear it at night, the clicking, faint and distant. And I wonder if it's still watching me, or worse, if it's waiting. My name is Maggie Carter, and I was 32 years old when this happened. It was last fall in Cook Forest State Park, Pennsylvania. I had just gone through a divorce, and I needed space to breathe, to think, to figure out what was next. As a travel blogger and photographer, I was used to being on my own, but what happened in those woods still keeps me up at night. Cook Forest is famous for its ancient pines. Towering trees that seem to touch the sky, their sheer size and age give the forest an almost mystical quality. It was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, remote, and teeming with natural beauty. I parked my RV at the Ridge campground, eager to capture some stunning shots for my blog. The ranger who checked me in was named Will. He was probably in his mid-40s, with a weathered face and a stern demeanor. "You'll want to stay on the marked trails," he said, handing me a map. "I know," I replied with a polite smile. Will didn't smile back. "And if you hear anything strange out there, whispers, voices, just ignore it. It's nothing but the wind." The way he said it made me pause. "Whispers?" I asked. He sighed, looking uncomfortable. "Local legend. People talk about a witch, say she lures folks off the trail with her voice. You know how these stories go." I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I'll be sure not to follow any spooky whispers." But Will's expression didn't change. "Just be careful," he said. And that was the end of it. I spent the first day hiking and taking photos. The forest was breathtaking. Columns of ancient pines, their bark rough and gnarled with age. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss and ferns. I felt a rare sense of peace, something I hadn't experienced in months. Around midday, as I was setting up a shot of the sunlight streaming through the trees, I heard someone behind me. Turning, I saw a man standing a few yards away, watching me. He was disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse. I took a cautious step back. "I'm just hiking," I said. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man shook his head violently. "You don't understand. She's watching. She knows you're here. You need to leave before it's too late." "Who's she?" I asked. But before I could get an answer, he turned and bolted into the woods. I called after him, but he didn't stop. After a few moments, the forest fell silent again, and I tried to shake off the encounter. Probably a drifter, I told myself. Someone who'd been out here too long and lost his grip on reality. That night, back in the RV, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. Everything looked normal at first. Pictures of the trees, the sunlight, the underbrush. But then I noticed something strange. In one of the photos, there was a shadowy figure standing among the trees. A woman, it looked like, wearing what appeared to be a long, tattered dress. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't remember seeing anyone when I took that shot. Then came the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, faint murmur that seemed to come from outside the RV. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, unmistakably female, calling my name. I froze, my mind racing. How could anyone know my name? The whisper came again, closer now. "Maggie!" I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, my hands trembling. Shining the beam into the darkness, I saw nothing but trees. Still, the whisper persisted, circling the RV. "Maggie, come outside." I locked the doors, my heart hammering in my chest. It had to be a prank, I thought. Someone messing with me. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning, I met Will on the trail and told him what had happened. His face went pale. "You heard the whispers?" I nodded, feeling foolish even as I said it. It was probably just the wind, right? Will didn't answer right away. Instead, he scanned the trees, his expression wary. "Stay out of the deep woods," he said finally. "Promise me you'll stick to the marked trails." "What's out there?" I asked. "Nothing you want to find," he replied. And that was all he would say. That afternoon, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. Maybe it was my stubborn streak, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. The trail twisted and turned, the trees growing denser with every step. After an hour, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. The path was narrowing, the ground uneven and overgrown. And then I saw the symbols. They were carved into the bark of a tree, a series of circles, triangles, and crude stick figures. I'd never seen anything like them before. Taking out my camera, I snapped a few pictures. That's when I heard the voice again. Maggie. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the shadows. There was no one there, but the voice was unmistakable. Come closer, it said, soft and inviting. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, pushing deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a clearing. In the center stood an ancient pine, its massive trunk covered in the same symbols I'd seen earlier. And there, beneath the tree, was the figure from my photo. She was tall and gaunt, her face pale and hollow-eyed. Her dress hung in tatters, and her hair was long and wild. She raised a hand, beckoning me closer. Maggie, she whispered, you've come so far. Don't you want to see the truth? My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed by a mix of fear and fascination. What do you want? I managed to ask. She smiled, a slow, chilling grin. To free you from your pain, to give you eternity. I didn't understand what she meant, but every instinct in my body screamed for me to run. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. Maggie, don't leave. When I finally reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving with every ragged breath. The whispers continued outside, circling the vehicle, tapping on the windows. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The next morning, I found the stranger waiting for me at the edge of the campground. His face was pale, his eyes wild. She marked you, he said. You'll never be free now. What do you mean? I demanded. She wants you, he said. She'll keep calling until you go to her. Desperate, I begged him for help. He told me there was only one way to break her hold. I had to destroy the symbols at the base of the ancient pine. That night, armed with a flashlight and a knife, I returned to the clearing. The forest seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The figure was waiting, her hollow eyes fixed on me. Don't do this, she said, her voice soft and pleading. You don't understand what you're giving up. Ignoring her, I plunged the knife into the bark, tearing through the carved symbols. The reaction was immediate. A deafening scream echoed through the forest, the ground shaking beneath my feet. The figure dissolved into shadows, her voice fading into a furious wail. When I returned to the RV, the symbols around my campsite were gone, and the whispers had stopped. But I still don't feel safe. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel her watching, waiting. My name is Alex Porter, and I'm 29 years old. I make my living as a freelance photographer, which isn't as glamorous as people think. It's a lot of rejection, long hours, and a constant fear of failure. Still, I love it, most of the time. When I got the assignment to capture the fall colors of Michaud's State Forest for a travel magazine, I thought it would be a much-needed escape. A few days alone in nature, doing what I love, sounded perfect. It wasn't. I arrived at Michaud late on a crisp October afternoon. The drive had been long, winding through back roads and into the heart of the forest. My RV was packed with camera gear, snacks, and just enough camping supplies to survive a few days off-grid. The campsite I picked was deep in the woods, far from the main trails, perfect for capturing untouched landscapes. The forest was alive with color, blazing reds, fiery oranges, and golden yellows that practically glowed in the soft light. It was everything I'd hoped for. After parking, I grabbed my camera and went exploring, snapping shots of the trees and the Clarion River winding through the forest. The first few hours felt like magic. That night, after dinner, I sat outside by a small fire, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop. They were off. Some shots had strange distortions, blurred shadows in places they shouldn't be. At first, I thought it was a camera issue, but the distortion was consistent in several photos, always in the same spots. I brushed it off as a technical glitch and went to bed. The next morning, I set out early, determined to make up for the previous day's weirdness. I followed a narrow, overgrown path deeper into the forest, lugging my tripod and gear with me. That's when I found it. A massive oak tree, ancient and gnarled, with strange symbols carved deep into its bark. The carvings looked old, but disturbingly fresh at the same time. They were intricate, geometric, almost like runes, but none I'd ever seen before. As I circled the tree, taking pictures, the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. A sudden, sharp pain shot through my hand. I looked down to see a shallow cut on my palm, though I hadn't touched anything sharp. Blood dripped onto the mossy ground. Shaking it off, I wrapped my hand in a bandana and continued my hike. Around midday, I stumbled into a circular clearing. The ground was blackened, as if scorched by fire, and in the center stood a crude stone altar, stained with dark streaks that looked like dried blood. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but curiosity, and maybe a bit of professional ambition, pushed me to take a closer look. As I set up my tripod to photograph the altar, I felt the temperature drop. The air grew colder, and the forest around me fell silent. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. I snapped a few shots, but the sense of unease grew stronger with every second. That night, as I sat by the fire, I reviewed the photos. The shots of the clearing were fine, perfectly framed in fact, but the ones of the altar were distorted again. Blurred shapes filled the edges, almost like shadowy figures, but when I zoomed in, they vanished. I told myself it was nothing and tried to sleep. I woke to the sound of footsteps circling the RV. Not human footsteps, too heavy for that, more like the slow, deliberate tread of a large animal. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened the door and shone it into the woods. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, now retreating into the trees. I closed the door and locked it, my pulse racing. When I checked my camera, which I'd left on a tripod outside, I found a new photo had been taken. It showed the RV, but in the foreground, barely visible, was a cloaked figure standing in the shadows. Determined to find answers, I hiked back to the altar that morning. Near the base of the stone, I noticed a hollow in the ground, partially concealed by moss. Inside, I found an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries told the story of a woman accused of witchcraft in the 1700s. She had lived in the forest, performing rituals and creating the Mark, a cursed area meant to protect her from the townsfolk. When they eventually captured her, they burned her alive in the clearing. Her final entry read, "I curse this land, my spirit shall guard it. Those who trespass will know my wrath." I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. That night, the whispers started, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but soon they became words, soft, sing-song, and unmistakably female. "Alex," I froze. The voice was coming from outside. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the RV, scanning the darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, until I saw her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in tattered black robes, her face hidden beneath a hood. Her skeletal hands reached out toward me, and though I couldn't see her eyes, I felt them boring into me. "Leave!" she hissed, her voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the door and shutting all the blinds. But it didn't matter. All night, the whispers continued, growing louder and more desperate. I felt her presence pressing against the walls, her fury palpable. Over the next day, things spiraled out of control. I began losing track of time, finding strange symbols carved into the walls of the RV and into my skin. They were the same runes from the tree, etched deep into my forearms as though I'd done it myself in my sleep. I tried to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. My satellite phone was dead. Every trail seemed to loop back to the altar. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep me there. That night, I returned to the altar, the journal in hand. The whispers guided me, drawing me deeper into the forest until I stood once more in the charred clearing. She was waiting for me, her form towering, her face now visible. A hollow, desiccated skull with empty black sockets where eyes should have been. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't respond, only raised a skeletal hand, and suddenly my mind was filled with visions, my failures, my doubts, every rejection, every moment of self-doubt I'd ever experienced. It was overwhelming, suffocating, as though she was feeding on my insecurities. I fell to my knees, clutching the journal. Then I remembered her curse. It fed on fear and despair. If I gave in, I'd become another spirit bound to this place. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You don't control me." Summoning every ounce of courage, I struck a match and set the journal on fire. The flames roared to life, consuming the pages, and the witch let out a blood-curdling scream. Her form began to waver, dissolving into the smoke, and the clearing erupted in light. I woke at dawn, lying on the forest floor. The altar was gone, reduced to ash, and the forest felt lighter, as if the weight that had been pressing down on it had lifted. I limped back to the RV. This time, the engine started without issue. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her one last time, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. I haven't returned to Misho since, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear whispers, and I wonder if the witch's mark is truly gone, or if she's still waiting for the next trespasser. My name is Jordan Miller, and I was 27 when this happened. It's been a year, and I still can't talk about it without sweating, without feeling like someone's watching me from the corner of the room. This all happened in the Loyalsock State Forest, Pennsylvania, during what was supposed to be a 3-day hike with friends. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. It was Ryan's idea to hit the trail. He'd just landed a big promotion at work and wanted to do something adventurous. Nothing too crazy, he'd said. Just some hiking, camping, bonding, good vibes all around. That was Ryan for you. The fearless leader, always in control, always with a plan. Sam, our no-nonsense camping expert, wasn't thrilled about it. "The Loyalsock's no joke," she said, tossing her gear into the back of Ryan's SUV. "You better know what you're doing, or you'll end up on the news." Emily, my little sister, was the wild card. At 24, she was bubbly and impulsive, the type to bring a selfie stick and makeup to a camping trip. She was woefully underprepared, but she was eager to spend time with me, and I wasn't about to discourage her. We parked at the World's End trailhead and loaded our gear into Ryan's RV. The plan was to hike during the day and sleep in the RV at night, moving it along to different spots on the trail. Seemed safe enough, but safe is a relative term. The first day was fine, great even. The weather was cool and clear, and the trail was challenging but manageable. Emily struggled a little, her designer boots not quite cutting it, but Ryan encouraged her. "You're doing great, Em," he said. "Keep it up." By sunset, we reached a clearing and set up camp. We lit a fire, roasted marshmallows, and laughed at Ryan's bad jokes. I could see Sam relaxing a bit, her usual tough exterior softening as she shared ghost stories with Emily. It was that night when things started to feel off. Lying in the RV, I heard it first. A faint, rhythmic drumming, carried on the wind. I sat up, straining to listen. It wasn't mechanical or natural. It sounded like hands on stretched hide. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Emily, in the bunk above me, muttered, "Probably just the wind." She rolled over, but I could hear the nervous edge in her voice. Sam wasn't so dismissive the next morning. She'd noticed strange symbols carved into trees near the campsite. Circles, triangles, and crude stick figures. "Probably just kids messing around," Ryan said, but Sam wasn't convinced. "This is old," she said, running her fingers over the grooves, like really old. Ryan waved it off, eager to get moving. I wish I'd listened to her then. Day 2 was harder. The trail grew steeper, the terrain rockier. Emily's boots finally gave out, the soles peeling off like wet paper. Ryan grumbled but improvised, giving her a pair of sandals from his pack. By mid-afternoon, we'd missed a trail marker and wandered into unmaintained territory. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Sam asked, scanning the dense forest. "Trust me," Ryan said, though he sounded less confident. "The waterfall's just ahead." But there was no waterfall, just more trees, more rocks, and that unsettling feeling of being watched. The drumming returned that evening, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. Sam heard it too, her face pale in the flickering firelight. "This doesn't feel right," she said. "We should turn back tomorrow." Ryan was stubborn. "We're not lost, we just need to find the trail again." That night, Emily woke up screaming. "I saw something," she cried, clutching her sleeping bag. "A shadow out there." Ryan grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, cursing under his breath. "There's nothing here, Em," he shouted, the beam slicing through the darkness. But I saw it too, just for a second. A figure, tall and gaunt, slipping between the trees like smoke. We broke camp at dawn, the mood tense. None of us spoke as we trudged forward, hoping to find the trail. Around noon, we stumbled upon an old campsite. At first, we thought it was abandoned. The tent was shredded, its fabric flapping in the breeze. Bones, small, pale, were scattered around the fire pit. Sam knelt to examine them. "Animal, maybe," she said, though her voice wavered. "Let's keep moving," Ryan said. The trail didn't improve. The forest closed in, branches clawing at our arms and legs. By the time we stopped to rest, Emily was crying, her feet blistered and bloody. Ryan, frustrated, climbed a nearby ridge to get his bearings. That's when it happened. The ground beneath him gave way and he fell into a pit. "Ryan!" I shouted, rushing to the edge. The pit was deep, lined with sharpened stakes. Ryan lay at the bottom, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood pooling beneath him. "Oh, God," Emily sobbed. "We have to get him out," I said. Sam shook her head. "We can't, not without help." Ryan groaned, his face pale. "Go. Find someone." We set up camp near the pit, reluctant to leave him alone. As night fell, the forest came alive with sound, drumming, chanting, the snap of branches. I felt eyes on me, though I saw nothing when I turned. Around midnight, Ryan started screaming. "They're here!" he shouted, his voice raw with terror. "They're watching me!" We shone our flashlights into the pit, but it was empty. Ryan was gone, his blood smeared across the stakes. Panic set in. Sam insisted we leave immediately, but Emily refused. "We can't just leave him," she cried. "We don't have a choice," Sam snapped. The argument was cut short by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the campsite. Shadows flitted between the trees, their movements too fast, too fluid to be human. "They're toying with us," Sam whispered, clutching her knife. The next day was chaos. Traps littered the forest, nooses hanging from branches, pits concealed by leaves. Emily tripped one, narrowly avoiding a broken ankle. "We're being hunted," Sam said grimly. "We need to get out of here." By dusk, we were hopelessly lost. The drumming grew louder, accompanied by guttural chants. Effigies made of bone and hair hung from the trees, their hollow eyes staring at us. Emily broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I can't do this anymore," she gasped. "Keep moving," Sam said, pulling her to her feet. That night, they came for us. We were huddled in the RV when the windows shattered and the door was wrenched open. Figures poured inside, human, but not, their bodies twisted and emaciated. They dragged Emily out, her screams echoing in the night. Sam and I fought, but it was futile. They were too strong, too fast. In the chaos, Sam shoved me toward the driver's seat. "Go!" she shouted. I gunned the engine and sped off, the headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, I saw them dragging Sam into the trees. I made it back to the trailhead barely. The RV was wrecked, its sides clawed and battered. I drove until I found a ranger station and stumbled inside, incoherent and covered in blood. A search party found nothing. No campsite, no pit, no Ryan, Emily, or Sam. Just me, rambling about shadows and drums. Now, a year later, I'm still haunted. By the sounds, by the shadows, by the question I can't answer. Why did they let me go? My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm 34 years old. I used to be a firefighter, but that was before the fire. Before I lost my wife, Emily, and our little girl, Sophie. It's been 2 years now, and most days I still wake up feeling like I failed them. That's why I started taking these trips, heading out into the wilderness alone, testing myself, trying to find peace where the world can't follow. This happened last October in Cook Forest State Park, Pennsylvania. The place is beautiful, especially in the fall. The air smells like pine and earth, and the trees glow with reds and golds. It's quiet there, a kind of quiet you can't find in the city. I thought it'd be the perfect spot to spend a few days, clear my head, maybe even feel human again. I was wrong. I parked my RV near the Clarion River, in a secluded spot where the only sounds were the water flowing and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. After setting up camp, I decided to hike a nearby trail, enjoying the crisp air and crunch of leaves under my boots. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm creeping in. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it. A howl, low and guttural, echoing through the trees. It wasn't a wolf. I've heard wolves before. This was deeper, almost human. I froze, staring into the darkness, but saw nothing. The forest was too thick, the firelight too dim. Probably just a coyote, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. I doused the fire and climbed into the RV, locking the door behind me. The howling came again, closer this time. I lay in bed, clutching my hunting knife, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. After breakfast, I grabbed my pack and set off on another hike, determined not to let my imagination ruin the trip. About 2 miles in, I saw him, an old man standing in the middle of the trail. His clothes were tattered, his beard long and unkempt. He had a wild look in his eyes, like someone who'd been alone in the woods too long. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse. I stopped short. "Excuse me." "The shadow that feeds," he muttered, his gaze darting around the trees. "It's watching you. It always watches." I opened my mouth to ask what the hell he was talking about, but before I could, he turned and shuffled off into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he'd appeared. The encounter left me rattled. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I made my way back to the RV, half expecting the old man, or something worse, to be following me. I got back to camp around noon, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I decided to distract myself by gathering firewood from the forest edge. That's when I saw it. A deer carcass, ripped apart and lying in a pool of blood. Its rib cage was exposed, the flesh torn as if by massive claws, and its heart was missing. I backed away, my stomach twisting. I've hunted before. I've seen animals killed by predators. This wasn't normal. Still, I told myself it had to be a bear or a mountain lion. What else could it be? I grabbed my firewood and hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, the howling returned, louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard something else. Whispers, faint and eerie, like a voice carried on the wind. They seemed to come from all around, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakably there. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was silent now, the only sound my own breathing. Then I saw them, tracks circling the RV. They were bipedal, with clawed toes, like something out of a nightmare. My chest tightened, and I backed inside, locking the door again. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, knife in hand, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around and find out. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I checked the battery, the fuel lines. Everything looked fine, but it wouldn't start. I grabbed my pack and decided to hike to the ranger station about 5 miles away. As I made my way through the forest, the whispers started again, louder now, more distinct. "Jake," they said. My name drawn out in a sing-song voice. I stopped, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer, just the sound of branches snapping behind me. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The wendigo. It stood at the edge of the trail, impossibly tall and gaunt, its limbs too long for its body. Its face was a skull, pale and cracked, with empty eyes that burned with malevolent light. Antlers jutted from its head, twisted and blackened like charred wood. I ran. Branches whipped against my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, the heavy thud of its steps, the guttural growl that seemed to rattle the very air. I stumbled into a clearing and turned to face it, knife in hand. The wendigo stepped into the light, its emaciated body shuddering with each breath. "You can't have me," I shouted, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince it or myself. The wendigo lunged, and I slashed wildly, the blade catching its arm. It shrieked, a sound that pierced my ears, and for a moment I thought I might have a chance. Then it swiped at me, claws tearing through my jacket and grazing my skin. I fell, scrambling backward as it loomed over me, its hollow eyes locked on mine. In that moment, I remembered something my grandmother used to say about the wendigo. It feeds on despair, on the guilt and grief we carry. And I had plenty of both. I closed my eyes, trying to push past the fear, past the pain. "You can't have me," I said again, this time with more certainty. "I won't give you what you want." The creature hesitated, its skeletal frame quivering. It let out a guttural growl, then turned and vanished into the trees, leaving me alone in the clearing. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking and bleeding, before I found the strength to move. When I made it back to the RV, the engine started on the first try. I didn't question it, I just drove, the forest blurring past me as I fled. It's been months now, and I still don't know if what I saw was real or just a manifestation of my own broken mind. But one thing's for sure, I left something behind in that forest. Something I'll never get back. I still dream about the wendigo sometimes. I hear its whispers, feel its shadow looming over me. But I also remember the moment I faced it down, the moment I refused to let it win. And in some small way, I think that's what keeps me going. My name is Mark Evans, and I was 38 when this happened. It was late September, the kind of crisp fall weather where the leaves blaze red and gold, and the air feels sharp enough to cut. I had driven my RV up to Pine Creek Gorge, also known as the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon, for a week of solitude and photography. After losing my younger brother Sam in a hiking accident the year before, I'd thrown myself into my work, hoping that nature could provide the peace my mind refused to give. I parked my RV at a small, nearly empty campground at the edge of Tioga State Forest. The campground was little more than a clearing with a fire pit and a few spaces for vehicles. The quiet was what I wanted. No distractions, just me, my camera, and the open wilderness. But what I found out there, I'll never forget. The first day was uneventful. I hiked along the main trail that skirted the gorge, pausing often to take photos of the vibrant foliage and the golden light spilling through the trees. It felt good to focus on my work, to lose myself in the intricacies of aperture and shutter speed. For the first time in months, I felt calm. That evening, as I was reviewing my photos in the RV, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find an older man standing there, bundled in a thick flannel jacket and holding a lantern. His face was weathered, his expression guarded. "You here alone?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, immediately wary. "Why?" He glanced toward the woods. "Just be careful. If you see a light out there, any light, don't follow it." I blinked, confused. "A light?" "They call it the Devil's Lantern," he said, his voice low. "It'll lead you off the trail, and if you follow it, you won't come back." I waited for him to laugh, to let me in on the joke, but his face remained grim. "Okay," I said finally, wanting to end the conversation. "Thanks for the warning." He nodded, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. The first time I saw the light was the next night. I had parked the RV closer to the trailhead for Leonard Harrison Overlook, hoping to catch the sunrise the next morning. Around midnight, I woke to a faint glow filtering through the RV's curtains. At first, I thought it was the moon, but the light was too bright and flickered strangely, like a flame. Curious, I peeked outside. There, in the trees, was a lantern. It swayed gently, as if carried by an invisible hand, the light casting long, wavering shadows across the forest floor. I squinted, trying to see who was holding it, but there was no one there. I told myself it had to be another camper, maybe the old man from earlier. But something about the way the lantern moved, it wasn't natural. It floated, almost gliding between the trees, and as I watched, it began to drift farther into the woods. I closed the curtain and went back to bed, determined to ignore it. But even as I lay there, the image of that floating lantern stayed with me, unsettling and inexplicable. The next morning, I tried to focus on my photography, hiking up to the overlook with my gear. The view was incredible. Layers of mist rising from the gorge, the forest below a sea of autumn colors. But something felt off. The trail markers, which I'd carefully noted on my map, seemed different. Some were missing, while others appeared in places I didn't remember. More than once I had to backtrack, convinced I'd somehow wandered onto the wrong path. And then I found the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, almost like a sun. Nearby, another tree bore a similar carving, this one with a crude stick figure inside the circle. I took a photo, thinking it might make for an interesting blog post, but the sight of it left me uneasy. It didn't look like something a bored hiker would scratch into a tree. It looked ancient. That night the lantern returned. This time it was closer, the light spilling through the windows of the RV like liquid gold. I sat frozen, my heart pounding as I watched the glow move between the trees. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard my brother's voice. "Mark!" I shot upright, my breath catching. The voice was soft, almost pleading, and it came from outside. "Mark, help me." I flung open the door, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Sam?" I called, my voice shaking. "Sam, is that you?" The lantern was there, just beyond the tree line, its light flickering invitingly. The voice came again, closer this time. "Mark, please, I need you." Every rational part of me knew it couldn't be real. Sam was gone. I'd been there when he fell, heard the sickening crack as he hit the rocks below. But in that moment, reason didn't matter. All that mattered was the sound of his voice, pulling me forward. I stepped into the woods. The forest was silent except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The lantern floated ahead, always just out of reach, leading me deeper and deeper into the trees. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly, but I couldn't stop. My brother's voice was calling me, desperate and urgent, and I had to find him. Then the light vanished. I froze, the darkness pressing in around me. My flashlight flickered, the battery dying, and panic began to set in. "Sam!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "Where are you?" The reply wasn't his voice. It was a metallic clinking, like the sound of chains rattling, followed by a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My chest tightened, and I turned back the way I'd come, only to find the trail gone. The trees were different now, their twisted trunks forming a wall that seemed to shift and close behind me. And then I saw it. A rusted lantern hanging from a tree, its glass cracked and smeared with soot. Beneath it lay a pile of bones, human and animal, picked clean and arranged in a grotesque circle. My flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the air like a living thing. I wasn't alone. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The next thing I knew, I was slamming the door shut, locking it behind me as if the thin walls of the vehicle could protect me. The lantern's glow still flickered in the distance, but it didn't come closer. Instead, it hovered there, a silent reminder of whatever waited in the woods. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear, started the engine, and headed back toward civilization. But as I drove, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. The lantern was following me. Even now, I can't explain what happened in those woods. The photos I took show nothing out of the ordinary, but I know what I saw, what I heard. The Devil's Lantern isn't just a story, it's real. And it's still out there, waiting for someone else to follow its light. My name is Lisa Grant, and I'm 41 years old. A year ago, I sold everything I owned, packed up my life into an old RV, and hit the road. I told myself it was for freedom, for the adventure of living off-grid, but the truth is, I was running. Running from the pain of losing my daughter, Chloe, in a car accident I'll never forgive myself for. This is the story of what happened to me in a place called Devil's Hollow, and I'm not sure if I'll ever stop running now. It started as just another stop on my journey, a remote corner of Rothrock State Forest in Pennsylvania. The locals called the area Devil's Hollow, a name steeped in folklore. I didn't pay much attention to the stories. It was secluded, quiet, and perfect for the week of solitude I needed to test my survival skills and reset my mind. I parked the RV at the edge of a steep ravine, the dense forest and rocky terrain stretching out before me. As I stepped outside, I noticed the stillness. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that swallows sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet broken only by the crunch of my boots. After unloading my gear, I ventured toward the ravine to scout a campsite. That's when I saw the first oddity. Jagged carvings in the rocks, twisted faces frozen in silent screams. They looked weathered, ancient, but there was an undeniable craftsmanship to them. That night, I set up camp near the entrance to a shallow cave. It felt sheltered, safe. The fire crackled as I sat alone, eating from a tin of beans and staring into the darkness. I thought about Chloe, as I often did, the ache in my chest as familiar as breathing. I glanced at my watch, midnight. The fire burned low as I started packing up for bed. That's when I noticed my watch had stopped. The hands were frozen at 8:17, the exact time of Chloe's accident. I shook it, but it didn't move. That was when I heard the voice. "Lisa?" It was soft, distant, like the wind whispering through the trees, but it was unmistakable. I froze, my blood turning to ice. "Lisa!" It came again, closer this time. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight sweeping the trees. Nothing. My breath came in shallow gasps as I strained to listen, but the voice was gone. I convinced myself it was just the wind and climbed into my sleeping bag, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I set out to explore the ravine. It was rugged terrain, the kind of challenge I thrived on. The forest grew denser as I descended, the light filtering through the trees dim and eerie. I was halfway down when I met him. "Hey there!" a voice called out, startling me. I turned to see a young man standing a few yards away. He looked like a hiker, with a weathered backpack and scruffy brown hair. His clothes were damp, like he'd just come from the creek. "You lost?" he asked, his tone friendly. "No," I said, still catching my breath. "Just exploring. What about you?" "Been here a while," he replied vaguely, his eyes scanning the trees. "Name's Evan." I introduced myself, though something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact or the faint unease his presence stirred in me. Still, I was glad for the company, if only to break the oppressive loneliness. Evan walked with me for a while, pointing out paths I might have missed on my own. Eventually, we came across a deeper cave carved into the ravine wall. Its entrance yawned like a mouth, jagged rocks framing the darkness. "Shortcut to the other side," Evan said, gesturing toward it. "You've been through there?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Once. It's tricky, though. Stick close." Against my better judgment, I followed him inside. The cave was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. My flashlight's beam barely pierced the darkness, illuminating strange symbols carved into the walls. They looked like runes, their meaning unknowable but ominous. Halfway through, I heard Chloe's voice. "Mom?" I froze, my heart pounding. It was faint but clear, her voice as unmistakable as my own name. "Mom, help me." I turned toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hands. "Chloe?" Evan grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "Don't follow it," he said, his voice low. "It's not real." But it sounded so real. I yanked my arm free and ran toward the voice, deeper into the cave. The cave twisted around me, its walls narrowing and expanding in impossible ways. I stumbled into a chamber that looked nothing like a cave. It was Chloe's bedroom. Her pink comforter was neatly folded, her stuffed animals arranged on the bed. The air smelled of lavender, just like the candles she used to burn. "Mom?" She stood in the doorway, her wide blue eyes filled with fear. She looked just as she had the day of the accident, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Chloe," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm here." I reached for her, but the room dissolved, replaced by the inside of a car. My hands gripped the wheel, headlights blinding me as they veered into my lane. The sound of tires screeching, glass shattering, Chloe's scream. It all played out again, over and over, a cruel loop I couldn't escape. "You let her die?" a voice hissed. It wasn't Chloe's, it was deeper, darker. "You deserved this." Evan's voice cut through the chaos. "Lisa, wake up." I jolted back to reality, finding myself in the cave again. Evan stood over me, his face pale, his eyes hollow. What's happening?" I stammered. "It's the hollow," he said. "It preys on people like you, people who can't let go." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed. "I was like you, trapped here years ago. It feeds on guilt, despair. It wants to break you." The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. A shadow emerged from the far end of the cave, a mass of writhing blackness with glowing red eyes. Its form shifted and pulsed, radiating malice. Evan stepped in front of me. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady. The entity let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated through my bones. It spoke without words, its presence invading my mind. "Give in, Lisa. Relive your failure. It's all you deserve." I wasn't going to let this thing consume me. I dug into my pack and pulled out my camp stove and a bottle of fuel. Evan looked at me, his expression grim. "Fire," he said. "It hates fire." I doused a rag in fuel, lit it with my lighter, and swung the makeshift torch at the shadow. It recoiled, its roar echoing through the cave. Using the moment, I grabbed a piece of the rune-covered wall and shoved it into the flames. The fire flared blue, and the entity screamed, its form writhing as cracks of light spread across it. The cave began to collapse as the entity dissolved into smoke. Evan grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the entrance. "Go!" he shouted. We stumbled out into the open air as the cave crumbled behind us. I turned to thank him, but he was gone. I returned to my RV, shaken but alive. As I drove away from Devil's Hollow, I saw a message scratched into the dirt at the edge of my campsite. "You're stronger than it." For the first time in years, I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe I could outrun my guilt after all. Maybe I could start living again.